Hi, I'm Malika Bilal, and you're in the stream, now live on Al Jazeera and YouTube.
And I'm Ahmed Shahabuddin. Today we're diving into three stories that really have our community talking. We begin in Washington, D.C., where the fallout continues following U.S. President Donald Trump's historic meeting in Helsinki this week with Russian President Vladimir Putin.
There is even more confusion about what President Trump believes or does not believe about Russian interference in the 2016 U.S. presidential election. On Monday in Helsinki, Trump would not say if he believed U.S. intelligence officials' assessment that Russia meddled in his country's election, an election he won. His misstep sparked admonition from both Democrats and Republicans and put the White House on the defensive. So on Tuesday, he attempted to correct the error.
I realize that there is a need for some clarification. It should have been obvious. I thought it would be obvious, but I would like to clarify just in case it wasn't. In a key sentence in my remarks, I said the word would instead of wouldn't. The sentence should have been, I don't see any reason why I wouldn't or why it wouldn't be Russia.
The latest twists have seen President Trump at odds with his aides and at one point with himself. Joining us to discuss the fallout and how the White House and the president are handling it is Al Jazeera's very own White House correspondent, Kimberly Halkat. Welcome to the stream, Kimberly. I want to start with a tweet. Where else? President Trump's Twitter feed. This was tweeted July 18th, just this Wednesday. So many people at the higher ends of intelligence loved my press conference. Putin and I discussed many important subjects at our earlier meeting. We got along very well, which truly bothered many haters who wanted to see a boxing match. Big results will come. Kimberly, has the president, in your mind, and based on your reporting and poll numbers that you've seen, has he convinced voters here that he takes allegations of Russian interference seriously?
I think there's been widespread concern by both Democrats and Republicans about the president's sort of wavering back and forth with his reluctance to accept the intelligence of very prominent, well-respected, not just members of the U.S. government, but also members of his own administration. That's been concerning to members on Capitol Hill. In fact, so much so we've seen just even here in Washington on Thursday, a vote in the Senate. And what's so interesting about this vote, Malika, is that it was unanimous. What they were voting on is something that was discussed behind closed doors between Vladimir Putin and Donald Trump in Helsinki and been very concerning to members of Congress. And this is the idea that there could be this exchange back and forth between the United States and Russia, where Russia could essentially question two U.S. citizens, a former U.S. ambassador and also a U.S. businessman, in fact, one that they have convicted in absentia of corruption. And in exchange, the United States would get to question 12 Russian intelligence officials with regard to them being indicted by the special counsel, Robert Mueller. Well, this has just outraged members of Congress, particularly Democrats who say subjecting diplomats to what they've called Putin's thuggery is an abuse of power. So they voted in the Senate 9-8-0 to make sure that never happens. What we're seeing is this pushback against the president by the legislative branch. And in a divided America, this is really stunning.
And Kimberly, to your point, divided America, there are so many divisions between the different branches of governments and also between the people. And a lot of people asking the questions about loyalty. Who is Donald Trump loyal to? H.G. Flores, for example, saying at the Helsinki summit, Trump revealed his loyalty is to himself above all else. In aligning himself with Putin over his own intelligence community, Trump demonstrated his willingness to throw America under the bus in pursuit of self-preservation. Now, Kimberly, self-preservation is hardly an unusual pursuit for politicians, but in this case, is this really the watershed moment it's been made out to be? Trump said that it's a shame there's even a little bit of a cloud over his election, kind of tying his election to the Russian investigation. Is this a pivotal moment?
Certainly, there are many in the United States that believe it is. Often we can't tell without a little bit more distance. What I can tell you is significant, Donald Trump reverting to his standard playbook, and that is to blame the fake news media for the negative coverage that, whether you're liberal or conservative in the United States, most people have panned as being an example of where the president at best was utterly unprepared for that very, very pivotal meeting. When you take into context the historical significance of a U.S. president and a Russian president standing side by side, given the history of the two countries being adversaries, there was no question that the president should have been prepared for the conversation and showed that he wasn't. So in terms of self-preservation, Donald Trump, we know from his presidency, has this need to be accepted, well-liked when things go wrong. Instead of looking inward and reflecting and improving upon, listening to his communications team, taking the advice of his director of national intelligence, saying there still is Russian interference, something that was underscored again on Thursday by his Department of Homeland Security secretary, he instead lashes out. This has been his default setting. He's continuing to do this, blaming the media, blaming those that lack the higher intelligence he believes in order to understand the complexities and the nuances. But we all saw it for ourselves. The president messed up, and now he's in damage control mode. The White House has been doing so for 4 days.
So, Kimberly, the question on, I think, a lot of people's minds in the international community is it working, or will it have an effect on his base?
Well, we have poll numbers that tell us exactly that, and so far, no. I think what's interesting to note is that the president is essentially blaming the media for what happened and the perception that this did not go over well, and Republican supporters overwhelmingly agree with the president. I think the reason that some of this exists, and we have to look at some of the Gallup poll numbers going into the Helsinki press conference and summit, Russia doesn't register on the radar of the ordinary American voter the same way issues like the economy do, the same way immigration does, and governance. At the end of the day, we have to look at why Donald Trump was elected. It's because there's dissatisfaction with the system. There's no transparency, accountability, and Capitol Hill is to blame for much of that. But we've not yet addressed that underlying issue, and so this continues and perpetuates.
And Kimberly, when you talk about this continuing and perpetuating, looking at the international perspective on all this, what about the future? I mean, Casey on Twitter saying, what does the rest of the world think of the fact that POTUS is a pathological liar who kowtowed to a Russian dictator and is now considering sending a U.S. diplomat to Russia for interrogation? What does this do when President Trump casts so much doubt on this specific case, whether Russia interfered in the U.S. elections, when there are future elections around the world at stake, whether in Chechnya, whether elsewhere around the world?
Certainly, the U.S. relationship with its allies is changing in large part because of the relationships with Donald Trump. We've seen many of his policies being very insular. He was elected on an America First platform. He certainly is doing that on a myriad of issues, immigration, trade. This is no exception. But certainly it leaves allies nervous, looking for other pathways, because there is no longer this belief internationally that the U.S. can be trusted and counted on. When it comes to lying politicians, well, let's be honest, Donald Trump's probably not the first politician that hasn't told the truth when it comes to U.S. presidents. And we've got a lot of examples of that. But certainly it is egregious. And I think, if anything, and I've certainly said this a number of times, what Donald Trump has done is he has awakened a rather reluctant electorate, one that's been a little bit lazy, for lack of a better word. So the fact that there is engagement now may be the best thing so far to come out of this presidency, looking towards the November elections in Congress. That's where there is the real opportunity for there to be change and for voters to be engaged.
And yet so much more news before we get to that November date. We will have to pause. She'll be covering it all. We will have to pause the conversation there. Thank you, Kimberly. But to see more of what she's covering at the White House, including a look at what it's like in the West Wing, follow her on Instagram. Her handle is @KimberlyHalcat_DC.
Turning to Haiti, where Al Jazeera correspondent Gabriel Elizondo has been using his Instagram account to show some of his reporting on the recent protests there. Haiti's prime minister has resigned following days of violent demonstrations sparked by the government's decision to raise fuel prices. The protests started on Friday, July 6th, after officials announced an increase in prices of up to 50%. And joining us to talk about this from Port-au-Prince, economist Kesner Farrell, and in New York, Gabriel Elizondo, who just returned from covering the unrest in Haiti. Welcome, everyone. Gabe, I want to start with you. Fadli Bonneau on Twitter is summing this up in a sense, saying, I was there in Haiti for 5 days, and there was no electricity in my part of town those 5 days, and I was in Port-au-Prince after the earthquake in 2010. They didn't give electricity for weeks, so the Haitian people need a break from the corruption that has plagued our country. And, you know, we've heard from many different people raising these kinds of issues, more long-term concerns, but then Fadli went to this, saying that 30% hike on gas is a death blow in Haiti. It would be like, if gas prices in the U.S. went to $5 a gallon. Could you contextualize this for us? Why did this happen?
Yeah, listen, I mean, it's this gas hike is more than just a simple hike on gasoline, because it affected all of Haitian society. It was a hike on gasoline, a hike on diesel fuel, and also, and this is key, a 50% hike on kerosene. Now you say, why is kerosene important? Because millions of Haitians rely on kerosene to power their homes because of a lack of electricity. So you say, okay, kerosene, let's just say it's $2 per liter. I'm just picking that number there. It's somewhere around there. Let's say it goes up by 50 cents. Oh, really? Is that really enough to take to the streets and riot? Well, you know what? If you're one of the more than 6 million Haitians that lives on less than $2 a day, a simple 50-cent increase in kerosene that powers your home is a big deal. And that's why we saw this just spiral like the way it did. And the gasoline, of course, affects primarily the business community that have trucks that they use to move their products around, the diesel fuel. So it affected the middle class, it affected the business community, and it also the poor with the kerosene affected, if this would have gone through at least.
Kessner, you hear Gabriel there explain how a gas price hike could lead to the fall of a prime minister. I pulled up this headline here from Jazeera.com. Haiti Prime Minister Jacques Guy-Lafontaine resigns after days of protests. I'm wondering, in your perspective, what you think the mood is like now, because of course we saw these protests, violent at times. What's the atmosphere? Is there still tension on the streets?
I could say that the mood is much better 1 week after I said what the protest started in July 6th. But I can tell you also there was a bad time management, because the prime minister had to resign 1 week after and under pressure from the parliament and also from the private sector. And Gabriel is right. He put it well in context. The kerosene is pretty much, what the poor people, they use in Haiti. And why is that? Because only 30% of the population got electricity. And this 30% is concentrated in the western department, not to say in the big metropolitan area of the capital. So by hiking the kerosene much more than the gasoline, I mean, that's a big fuel that you put on the fire. So he's so right about that. I can say the mood is much better, but we're still having some, I could say, the consensus government. The president is trying to get in touch with other people to see how they're going to get the next government.
It's interesting, the more we learn about what's actually happening on the ground, this is often being framed as well in a historic kind of context. We have this tweet from Fedley, actually, again, saying that the international audience should really realize that the Haitian people have been taken advantage of for years. The government elected takes advantage of them. The international community takes advantage of them. The French took advantage of them. With this latest incident, this decision even, who is really staged to gain and who is being taken advantage of, if anyone? Gabriel?
Well, that's a big question. You have about an hour and a half, and we got to get into that.
Well, I wish you knew. There were a whole another series of tweets asking Emmanuel Macron, for example, to actually step in and, kind of live up to his part of the bargain, if you will.
Right. I mean, listen, that's Kessner can probably answer that better than I can, but I would say that, listen, just to give a little context on this gas price hike, or proposed one, guess who proposed it? The International Monetary Fund. Because Haiti entered into a deal with the IMF in February of this year. The deal was this. The IMF said, we're going to help you get $96 million in much needed funds. The money was going to come from the World Bank, the IADB, and the EU. In exchange, though, the IMF told Haiti, we want you to do several things, one of which is raise the price of gasoline, because the gasoline prices, according to the IMF, were too low, and Haiti was losing income because they were subsidizing gasoline. So this all stems from the IMF's really pushing Haiti, quite frankly, to adopt this plan. The Haitian government knew it was going to be wildly unpopular. And so do you know when the Haitian government decided to announce this? You'll never guess. In the middle of a Brazil World Cup game. Why then? Because the vast majority of Haitians love Brazil. They love Brazilian football, and they were all watching the World Cup game. So the government thought that they were going to announce this. Maybe people wouldn't notice it. Turns out that wasn't the case. It went all over social media as soon as the game was over. Brazil lost. People took to the streets very upset, and there you go. The rest is history.
And we're seeing scenes from that day on our screens right now. Kestner, taking this back to the World Bank, the IMF, and of course having people online point the fingers there, saying yes, there's corruption in our country, but where does the actual guilt lie? I'm wondering what your take on that is. Is this a deal that the Haitian government should have entered into in the first place?
I think that the situation, the political crisis, is much more complicated. It's not only the price increase. We got to see also some bad governance. And you could see what you can call in political economy leadership malpractice. Why? Because the government wasn't having a contract with the IMF for the last 3 years, and they have been making deficits. And we're talking about a country where 60% of the population.
Looks like we might have just lost Kestner. He's coming to us from Port-au-Prince, and that does often happen. But Gabriel, he was talking about a point that, you know, our community is pointing the fingers at the IMF and the World Bank.
Yeah, they really are. And I mean, listen, Haiti has a long relationship with international donors, so that's no surprise there. But what Kestner was saying when he got cut off, or what I think he was saying, was this is more than just the gas price hike or proposed gas price hike. This is more than simply the IMF. It's easy in one way just to point the finger at the IMF, the World Bank, but you talk to almost all Haitians, and it looks like we got Kestner back, that's great.
Right.
You point to all Haitians and they usually mention one thing, and correct me if I'm wrong, Kestner, corruption. Government corruption.
And because you bring up corruption, I'm wondering if we tie politicians to these concerns. Haiti right now, we have a tweet saying, is sadly owned by the IMF. Donations meant to aid charities went to salaries and administration. But then we have Fawaz Ali asking, will the resignation of the Prime Minister bring a reduction of fuel prices? Your thoughts, Kestner?
I think they're going to freeze it for like the next 3 or 6 months. It's not going to solve the problems, because I can tell you the subsidy that they get on the fuel is pretty much $160 million of lost revenue, and they're losing $150 million also in like tax exemption to the private sector, to the free zones, like the assembly sector. And they're losing $150 million also from the electricity subsidies. We're talking about $300 million from a country with a budget only $2.5 billion. So there is a mismanagement in finance. That's what I was saying.
Right.
IMF, it's easy for some expert to stay in DC and say, increase your price, but also in Haiti, we got to put some fiscal order.
Right.
We got to pay, and also less corruption, as Gabriel said.
And Kestner, obviously that conversation is not going to end here, but we're thankful that you both joined us, Kestner Farrell and Gabriel Elizondo. And if you're not following him already, that is Gabriel. You can follow him, of course, on Instagram. His handle is gabriel.m.elizondo.
We end in Iraq, where a wave of protests across the south of the country have now expanded. Al Jazeera correspondent Imran Khan is on the ground covering the story. The demonstrations, which began in Basra, entered a second week, and despite the government's attempt to contain the unrest. At least 8 people have been killed in clashes with security forces. Joining us from Baghdad to discuss the growing protests is Al Jazeera correspondent Imran Khan. Welcome back to the stream, Imran. I'm starting with a piece that you wrote for the Al Jazeera website. Iraq struggles with economic energy crisis as protests spread. This is July 18th. How long has this tension been building in Basra?
Well, it's actually been building for the last 15 years. Basra has been severely underdeveloped when it comes to electricity infrastructure. But what sparked these protests were the fact that the Iranian government, who supplies electricity to the south, cut off supplies because the Iraqi government owes it some $1.5 billion in unpaid bills. Now, the protesters came out on the street when the electricity got cut off. They didn't blame the Iranians for this. They blamed squarely the Iraqi government for it, saying that this was another example of incompetence and corruption, that those bills weren't paid and therefore they are now suffering. The anger, you can see it on the screen there, just spilled over, and it's been a very long time in the making. Now, what we also saw was the protesters really asking for two key things. They want their energy back, electricity, clearly incredibly important, but they also want economic reforms as well. Basra is the oil hub of Iraq. It's the oil producing region, but they blame the foreign oil companies for employing foreign workers and not local Iraqis, and they say that's having an impact on them as well. So like I say, it's been a very long time in the making. However, it was only sparked in the last 2 weeks, and the government's very worried about all of this. They're very worried that the protests may well spread to places like Baghdad, and if it spreads and becomes a widespread movement, that could topple the government.
Imran, we have a lot of people commenting on Twitter, Dua and Ali, for example, about the corruption and some of what you brought up. Dua saying widespread corruption, fraud, and embezzlement in both public and private sectors, alongside with misallocation and misappropriation of public funds, are the two main reasons behind the lack of development and work opportunities in Iraq. Ali says only people that are connected to political parties can get jobs, and this violates the equality of opportunity. You touched on some of that, but how big a problem is nepotism and some of these allegations of corruption?
You only have to ask any Iraqi here what it's like to try and get anything done, even a basic thing like getting your passport done, and they will talk to you about the fact that they need wasta, they need influence with somebody to help them get it done. It's almost a way of life here. Many Iraqis are used to it, but they're getting more and more angry at the fact that you have to be connected now to a political party. You have to be connected to somebody to get anything done, to get a job in the government, to get a job in the army. So ordinary Iraqis are very frustrated about this, and they are taking to social media to complain about this. However, the government has shut down most of the social media in the country since these protests started. So the fact that you're able to see those tweets is quite extraordinary, given that you can't get onto Twitter here, you can't get onto Facebook. And that shows you just how worried the government is about these protests, about the social media element of these protests as well.
So they're shutting down social media. I'm wondering, is that the answer to the question I was about to ask you, is what is the government doing about this? What is their official response, and then the not so official response?
Well, the official response is to try and get a short-term solution to the energy crisis in the south. Like I said, the Iranians are the ones that were supplying it. There's unpaid bills of $1.5 million, so the Iranians aren't supplying that electricity anymore. So what the Iraqi government did was send a high-level energy delegation to Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia and Iran are key rivals in this region. Saudi Arabia has always been very worried about Iran's influence in Iraq, so they're seeing this as an opportunity to get some sort of political influence in Iraq, and the Iraqis are trying to negotiate a deal. If that happens, they'll be connected to the regional electricity grid, which will alleviate some of the problems in the south. But at what cost is that? Is it at the cost of factionalizing the country between those who are loyal to Iran and those who will then be loyal to Saudi Arabia? That's an unseen political cost that we don't know what's going to be. It depends on what this deal is, if any is struck with Saudi Arabia. Unofficially, the government are in panic. They are shutting down social media. They've put troops out on the streets in the south, and they're trying to really contain this. Like I say, if this becomes a big, widespread, nationwide movement, then that spells disaster for the government. You have to realize that the government currently is still waiting for contested election results. So it hasn't been able to form the new government. And Muqtada al-Sadr, one of the big winners in the elections, a cleric and politician, sent out a tweet today saying that until the protesters' demands have been met, or at least listened to, we shouldn't be taking a look at forming a new coalition government. We should be listening to the protesters. That's an incredibly popular move by him, because it plays right into the hands of his supporters. And you have to remember, in the south, that's where he gets his support from. So a lot of politics going on. But again, much like in Haiti, as we heard Gabriel and our other guests talk about, when you talk about energy, you're talking about people's lives, and it affects people's lives, and that's why they're taking to the streets.
Right, and taking to Twitter as well. Yusra here says Iraq needs a fresh new start, because that, which happened in 2003, contributed to years of instability and weak governance. Hearing from a lot of Iraqis online. Please keep your comments coming, but unfortunately, we have to pause this part of the conversation and end the entirety of the conversation right here. Be sure to follow Imran on Instagram at Imranisms. For more of his and our other correspondents' reporting, head over to aljazeera.com. Until next time, we'll see you online.